Welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Rebecca Lubert and I'm the Director of Career and Business Engagement with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Welcome to our webinar today, Navigating Your Identity, LGBTQ in the Workplace. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our members and donors of the Alumni Association for powering our alumni webinar series. And we'd like to thank you for your support. You may learn more about this at umnalumni.org/membership. We'd also like to thank our Maroon and Gold Network and our Minnesota Alumni Market for presenting today's webinar. The Maroon and Gold Network is a free online platform from the University of Minnesota Alumni Association for career-related advice, networking, and mentorship. To learn more about that, you may go to Maroon and Gold Network, u.umnalumni.org. The Minnesota Alumni Market is a first of its kind online store dedicated to supporting U of M alumni-owned businesses and their products. You can learn more at mnalumnimarket.com, and these websites and links will be sent to all registrants after today's webinar. You may also be interested in some upcoming events, such as our Career Month. So we are hosting Career Month and it's in its third year this coming February. So be on the lookout for that. We have lots of exciting events that are to come. So be on the lookout for that information. You can find that information on our website in the next few weeks or so. All right. So if you're listening in today and you wish to do so by phone, you may do so by dialing the number on your screen and entering the webinar ID when prompted. For today's webinar, we'll be having a panel with moderated questions, and then we'll have an opportunity for our audience members to ask questions as well. You may enter those questions into the Q&A box or the chat box at any time, but we'll reserve the last 15 minutes or so for those questions. And the recording of this webinar will be shared with everyone who's registered for this within the next 2 to 3 business days. All right. So before we get started, we want to kind of gauge who our audience members are and learn more about your experience as well. So let me get that. Oops, sorry. Oh, here we go. All right. So as an LGBTQ student or alum, how would you rate your satisfaction of your college experience regarding resources, support, and belonging? So I'm going to launch that poll right now for you. And then I'll reveal the results. And this is an anonymous poll. All right, so it looks like 64% of folks voted. Let me end the poll and share the results with all of you. So here we have folks who answered, 3% answered very unsatisfied, 30% answered unsatisfied, 52% answered satisfied, and 15% answered very satisfied. And I suppose this is dependent on one's time in school and what the resources were available at the time when folks were enrolled at the university and so forth, and dependent on your experiences, individual experiences. So today, this kind of prepares our conversation today to continue to talk about experiences within the university and in the workplace and some connections between those as well. And so from this, we'll be able to kick it over to introducing our moderator and continue the conversation as well. All right. So our moderator today is Nick Alm. Nick was born in St. Paul and grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota. Sorry, let me stop sharing this. Nick Alm was born in St. Paul and grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota, while pursuing a degree in Management Information Systems from the University of Minnesota. They co-founded the Carlson School's first undergraduate LGBTQ student organization, Compass. It was through this group that they developed a deep passion for advancing conversations about LGBT equity in the workplace and employment issues broadly. Today, Nick is the co-founder and executive director of Mosher, a social enterprise that helps organizations recruit and retain LGBTQ talent. Revenue from Mosher is granted to LGBTQ entrepreneurs in the 70 countries where being LGBTQ is still criminalized. To date, Mashir has funded and supported 10 LGBTQ-owned businesses within the tourism and agricultural space. In the long term, Mashir intends to be a local, national, and global leader on LGBT economic and employment equity. Thank you, Nick, and welcome. And I'll kick it over to you to begin introducing our panelists.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Hello, audience. I'll be super upfront with the fact that I can't stand these virtual events anymore. I'm just over it. I wish we could be in person. I'm looking out my window here and I'm just going to envision all 60 of you sitting out in the audience making eye contact. But for now, I guess I'm just going to settle with trying to look as deeply into my camera as possible so that we can connect. But this is really an exciting opportunity. I love the University of Minnesota so much. I also had a really difficult experience during my time at the university as a queer person. In the business school, the Carlson School, really realized firsthand just how unwilling we were as a community to really acknowledge that white supremacy, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, that we were unwilling to really own the fact that those pieces were foundational to the workplaces that we all exist in today. It wasn't a thing that we talked about. And maybe that was my biggest issue during my time, was just that there was a silence. There was an active hostility. I didn't experience active discrimination so much as there was just this general tone of, we don't talk about that. And so the fact that today we get to talk about that means so much to me, to be able to come back as an alum with other alum and talk about how our experiences were shaped during our time as a student, and then also talk about the barriers that we're encountering in the workplace today. And so if you're listening, if you're out there and you're somebody who is struggling a bit, I hope that you see yourself today, because we know we're not where we're supposed to be. With 3% of senior and executive positions at major companies being Black individuals, when we know that Black people make up about 12% of the population, only 4 Fortune 500 CEOs are LGBTQ, only 5% are women, 46% of the LGBTQ community is in the closet at work. Okay, let's let that sink in. 46% of people would not bring a photo of their family and put it at their desk at their workplace, right? And we know that being out as a spectrum, you're going to hear a lot about that today. We know that being out looks different for everybody. You might be out to a manager, but not a direct coworker, or vice versa. And that costs a lot for the individual, for their lifetime potential, and for the organization that they work for. So we are joined with some of the best of the best, and I am going to get right to introducing them. We've got some questions for them, and then we're going to open up to you at around 1:45. So be thinking about, what are your questions for this group? Throw them in the chat. We're going to be looking at them. This is meant to be interactive as a virtual conversation can be. Today's about breaking that silence. Today is about ensuring that people see themselves today, see themselves and their issues represented, and know that there's a whole big coalition of people that are working to change the workplace right now. So, Joe Braman. First up, Joe currently serves as a branch manager for Coldwell Banker in Stillwater. Prior to managing agents, Joe was selling real estate with his brother, Charlie Braman. And while attending the Carlson School of Management, Joe created the business plan for what would become Braman Brothers Real Estate, LLP. Joe now uses his experience as a successful agent, small business owner, and entrepreneur to help real estate agents build their own businesses. Welcome, Joe. Then we've got Ani Ryan Koch, they, them, and he, him pronouns. And I should have mentioned that Joe uses he, him pronouns. I use they, them pronouns. Ani is a sustainability design consultant principal at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. Ani's work at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota is at the intersection of community health and healthcare innovation. Their work includes equity consulting, facilitation, program design, and project management. Since 2016, they have been leading the Gender Care and Service Initiative to improve care for transgender and non-binary Minnesotans, impacting policy systems and workplace culture. Welcome, Ani. So great to have you on the panel. And then next we have the Jason Jackson, he, him pronouns. Jason serves as a HR diversity and inclusion consultant for HealthPartners. He holds an MA in organizational leadership and policy development and a BA in communication studies from the University of Minnesota. Jason has served as a director of the Lealtad Suzuki Multicultural Center in the Department of Multicultural Life at Macalester College, where he led programmatic efforts centered on social justice that promoted the growth and development of students and the institution. He's written curriculum on race and identity and taught courses in the U of M's Leadership Studies Department and served as the assistant director of the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life, where his work centered supporting students of color and enhancing educational efforts for staff, faculty, students, and outreach across the university. Jason, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today. And then last but not least, we have Patrick Scully. Patrick works in the performing arts and has extensive experience in creating work, performing, running a nonprofit, and creating space for LGBTQ people to live life on their own terms. In 1986, he founded Patrick's Cabaret, a long-running queer-friendly performance space that offered space for experimentation and easy access for performers to get their work on stage. His most current project, Leaves of Grass, Illuminated, is a play that presents Walt Whitman as a man who loved men and shines light on the centrality of Whitman's sexuality to his life and work. It has been performed at the Guthrie Theater and toured rural Minnesota extensively. Patrick is also one of the alumni leaders of the Pride Alumni Network. Patrick, thanks so much for being here. Excited to talk to you today. We're going to open up with our first question here. Jason, I'm going to open with you really quick. But before I do, I want to make a quick note on language. You're probably going to hear a lot of different acronyms today: LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA+. You might hear people use the term queer to broadly describe and organize anybody who falls outside of the realm of being cisgender or straight. So know that we recognize that across different generations, especially, language looks differently. Language means different things to different people and carries weight and emotions to that, and we're mindful of that. So we've got an intergenerational panel here today, so you're going to hear us bounce around. Just know that as long as you're trying to be inclusive, you'll always say the right thing. So, Jason, could we start with you? Is that okay? Would love to have you tell us about your experience at the university and the resources that existed and supported your journey. And what, on the converse side, what were some areas where there were gaps in your resources and support that you had when you were a student here?
Yeah.
And staff, I should say.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, y'all, for having me, and thank you, Nick, and everybody on the call for being here too. You know, at the University of Minnesota, you know, I would just say first and foremost that the university, when I left from working there and being a student, I think it still does have like a really little special place in my heart, right? I do have like really good thoughts and feelings generally about my experience at the University of Minnesota and some of the resources that existed while I was there, and noting that I was a non-traditional college student. I am still, I guess, a rebel rouser and a free spirit. And so I didn't go back to school until I was in my mid-20s. And so when I went back to school, I interned at what is now the GSC, the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center for Queer and Trans Life, used to be known as the GLBTA Programs Office. I can't believe I remember all of that. But that was a big one for me, because I remember there was, Dr. Ann Phibbs and Ross Neely. They were both staff members at that center, and they saw me and they probably even heard me first, and they pulled me into their department to work and do kind of like intern work there. And what they exposed me to was a lot of public speaking, putting myself out there and making mistakes, right? Just being younger. That was a big resource for me, having that GLBT center there. The Multicultural Center for Academic Excellence was another one because they centered their work on students of color. So I always kind of felt like, and more so in like a silo way, my identities were always supported. Another department I want to make sure I mention, I don't think I give them enough credit or speak to them enough, is the Disability Resource Center at the University of Minnesota, because, I'm pretty open about, being queer and person of color, but also experiencing chronic depression for as long as I remember, and being in school and having a center that not only, I would say, normalize talking about mental health and physical well-being as well, but mental health, but they also taught me what it meant to advocate for my own mental health well-being, and they showed me what that looked like. So I registered for, as a student with a disability, struggling with anxiety and depression. And I think that as I gotten more comfortable with myself, I took a lot of the tools from that center to advocate for not only myself, but people around me around mental health. So that was a service that I think that was critical just to my own development. And I want to make sure I name that. And then maybe some of the things that weren't there or were not particularly the most helpful, I, being Black and queer, what it meant to feel connected just to Black queer people. A lot of students still experience this as well. When you go to the student unions or the student groups, you may have like the BSU, the Black Student Union, and like the QSCC, the Queer Student Cultural Center. But then where do you find community that is more so similar to who you are? Those weren't there. However, at the university, I always felt like I could create those spaces, right? And I was given all the tools I needed. The student union activities, SUA, they also taught me what it meant to organize, right, in a lot of different ways. And so those are some of the really, I think, great resources at the university. But the university is so massive and decentralized that finding community at times could feel really, really difficult, right? Maybe more so than a smaller institution. So yeah, those are some of the things that kind of really stick out to me.
Jason, it sounds like you just really, you did not compromise. You said, this is who I am, this is all of me, and you went forward with that. And that, I think, is just one of the most exciting pieces of your story.
Oh, thank you.
We'll get more into that and how that transitioned into the workplace and coming out and compromising and things like that. But I want to give Ani a chance to answer a similar question. Ani, just to rephrase it in case you forgot already, it's we're just talking, what was the support system like at the university when you were here? Were there gaps? How did you plug in? What was missing?
It's interesting. I think about my time at the university more from being a community member perspective, maybe than a student. So when I was a student at the university, I was doing an executive program, which was primarily online because I kept my full-time job at the same time. So full-time job, full-time school, doing my MPH. And so the culture that was created around the university was like this. It was very virtual. Small teams with a really tiny cohort. We were the first executive cohort in that program. So there were only about 11 of us. And so it really happened through individual interactions with teachers, with teaching assistants, and then with my advisors. And so the things that came up for me a lot was doing a lot of education around just queer identity, basically. I mean, like the most basic level. Folks don't know what they don't know. So going back to the basics, talking about pronouns, talking about, trans 101, or if I had an idea for a paper that was maybe outside of the box or spoke to my community, having to do a little bit of education to bring professors along to see the importance of why I might want to focus it on it that way. That being said, Rebecca started off the call with, whether or not it was a positive experience or neutral or not. If there would have been a neutral option, I probably would have selected that, because I think I have just as many positive experiences as I do negative looking at those individual interactions. A quick note on the environment that the university creates. Again, I think I got involved long before I was a student there. As a community member, I would be brought in to do trainings for the med school and for the School of Dentistry on how to respectfully treat lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer patients. And so it always seemed like, okay, this is important to these schools. They want this training. But during each one of them, I always had this realization like, oh, this is it. This is going to be the first and the last time that these med students talk about this. This is going to be the extent of the training that they get on this before we send them out into the workforce. And so that to me is conflicting. There's enough value to look into the community and to pull in some expertise, but not enough to maybe lead and make it a focus area. And I think a lot of improvements have been made around that in the last decade, but I'll leave it there.
Well, I think what I want to hone in on is that so often the burden of that education falls on people like you, who are the only insert identity in the room. And if folks are on the call and you're wondering, how do I be a better ally? There's so many ways to get educated these days. That's the beauty of 2020. You know, trans and queer and people of color experience so many barriers as it is, that need to educate, that ask to then go above and beyond and overcome that, to then bring everybody else along. I'm sure, Ani, that was kind of a lot. And you do it, we'll talk about your job too, where it sounds like even today, that is who you are at this job too. Thanks so much for sharing that, Ani. I can't wait to get more into what you're up to now. But I want to hand it over now to Joe Braman. Joe, same question. What was it like at the University of Minnesota for you?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I was sort of struck as I was thinking about my experience from that poll question while you were speaking, because we were there. I was at the, Carlson in the MBA program full time, and you were in the undergraduate program at roughly the same time. Mm-hmm. And our experiences were so different. And I think it just sort of made me think about how rooted our experiences are in our expectations of what our experiences should be. And that really, I think that really sort of speaks to how progress happens, right? I was having very similar conversations with very similar people that you were. I was feeling somewhat satisfied and you were not, right? And so, I just think that that's it's an interesting thing to kick around a little bit in terms of how much we challenge ourselves in any given moment. But, for me on the MBA side, it was a really good experience. I think a little bit in contrast to maybe Jason's experience, where it is such a large world. At Carlson, the world is incredibly small, right? When you're in the full-time MBA program at Carlson, your world is about 180 people at any given time. And you see them every single day. And so, from the very top, from the dean's office to the student life, everyone was really supportive of the idea that we needed to be talking about diversity. We needed to be talking about LGBTQ issues. I will say that the only reason at the time that I think that it was such a priority is because before day one of orientation, I emailed them and I said, this needs to be a priority if I'm going to come here. And they said, well, there's a group you could be the president of. And I said, okay. And so, it is one of those things where also progress only happens if you're going to make it happen.
You were voluntold, as I like to say.
Exactly.
It is, Joe, and I love that you said that, because my expectations were through the roof, right? I was one of 2 openly gay people in a class of 700 in high school, and I thought college is going to be just this queer extravaganza, and it wasn't. It just wasn't. So you're right, but we'll be excited to dig in more, Joe, and kind of how your career was before that MBA and then afterwards, and your decision to be out and things like that. But thank you for kicking us off there. I want to get Patrick involved. Last but not least, Patrick, you had, I know, some very interesting experiences at the University of Minnesota as an Evans Scholar, as somebody who was very involved in social justice circles. So talk to us, what was it like?
Yeah, so I'll speak here about my undergrad experience, because I've also had graduate school and then experience at the university as an employee much more recently. But I was at the university from 71 to 76. And it was not a welcoming place. It was basically a pretty hostile place to be a young gay man on the verge of coming out. And what made it all the more difficult was that my being able to go to college was made possible because I was an Evans Scholar. But being an Evans Scholar meant you were required to live in the Evans Scholar's house. So imagine being, college age, about like feeling this growing awareness, wanting to come out and being surrounded by, well, if you ever saw the movie Caddyshack, you kind of have an idea of what the mentality might have been. And during our orientation week, actually, our pledge director, a senior Evans Scholar, a senior class member, encouraged all of us to be more active at the university than just being an Evans Scholar. Get out and be engaged in some organization. And then just to show how broad thinking he was, he named what was clearly to him a totally outrageous idea of something to get involved in. He said, you might even like join FREE, which was the gay rights organization on campus at the time, Fight Repression of Erotic Expression. And in that moment, when he particularly articulated FREE as something to join, I realized that that was exactly the thing not to do if one wanted to survive as an Evans Scholar. So the place that I lived as an undergrad was a pretty hostile place to be. And to survive, I created a persona around myself where basically I made the Chicago 8 seem kind of mainstream. I tried to present myself as being so left, so radical, that people would just leave me alone. And for the most part, it worked. And there were actually a few people who, in the classes that came in behind me, that sort of embraced the spirit of that, and where I actually started to feel like, as I became a junior or senior at the University of Minnesota, like there were some younger Evans Scholars who actually appreciated the kind of radical perspective that I was bringing to things. I remember one day in particular coming home from class. I'd been in a dance. I had started taking dance when I was an undergrad at the U, and but my major was biology and German. But coming home from class, must have been in the springtime, I was sitting in the living room at Evans Scholars, and one of the Evans Scholars said, wow, look at this. They teach, it's listed here in the course catalog, they teach dance at the University of Minnesota. Can you imagine if somebody living here took a ballet class? And I was so pissed off that I stood up, dropped my overalls to the floor. I was wearing my tights and leotards, having walked back from Norris Gym, and just walked out of the room and left my overalls on the floor and went up to my room as a way of just saying, like, fuck you. That being said, in the midst of all of that hostility, there were quiet, very sort of almost secretive places of support. So, for example, my major advisor, Frank Hirschbach, in the German department, He came to the United States when he was in high school. Basically, the head of his high school came to him and said, Frank, you're Jewish and things in Germany are getting really rough, and I'm worried for you. And I know you've got some family supports in the United States. Leave, go, save your life. And so when I was and Frank then came to the United States, went to school, got his PhD, and ended up teaching in the German program at the University of Minnesota. As a somewhat out gay man, but not completely out. But when I was a sophomore, I applied for a scholarship to go to study for a year, a University of Minnesota scholarship that still exists, to spend a year studying at the Free University in what was then West Berlin. And of the 85 students who applied, I was the one that got chosen and got sent to Berlin. And to this day, I believe that it was the sort of unspoken knowledge of Frank on that committee and a woman who seemed to me very clearly a lesbian identified woman on that committee, that they were going to send this about to burst open gay man to West Berlin as a wonderful cosmopolitan place for me to be able to come out. But now all of this happens without anybody ever speaking the truth of it. All of this happens just very quietly under the table with lots of assumptions. And maybe like 10 years later, after I'd come back from Berlin, I ran into Dr. Hirschbach at the 90s. And he said to me, seeing you here, Patrick, I can ask you what I've always been wondering, like, how was Berlin? And so, you know, I was at the university as an undergrad at a time when if you wanted to survive, you either had to be willing to like be a member of Free and be fighting on the front lines every day, or you had to be quietly organizing your support circles to survive in a world that was not welcoming like 99.9% of the time.
It must make you really happy, Patrick, to see how much it's evolved.
It does. And at the same time, I'm enough of a fighter that even in recent experience working at the university, I realized like how much farther we have to go. You know, it's gotten better in some ways. It's hugely better. I mean, the progress that we've made was unimaginable in my lifetime. At the same time, you know, I realized the kind of diversity that we experience today in the LGBTQ world existed in Berlin before the Nazis came to power and was eradicated. So I don't take for granted that what we've fought for and gained is here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Were you in school, Patrick, when Jack Baker was student body president?
I came in, I think the year that I started the U was the year that he got elected student body president, sitting in that sideways pose with his t-shirt, blue jeans, and high heels.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for folks on the call, that is a must-read piece of U of M history. Jack Baker was student body president of the University of Minnesota, I think 1976 and 77, around there.
Earlier, I think more like 71. I think more like 71.
71. Technically the first openly gay elected official in the country. And as Patrick said, the campaign posters are iconic because he's wearing pearls and high heels. And I think the slogan is "Put yourself in Jack Baker's shoes" or something like that. And his then partner, soon to be husband, they would go on to have the first gay marriage in Blue Earth County here in Minnesota in the 70s. His husband, Michael McConnell, lost his job. He was fired by the University of Minnesota library system for being gay. And President Kaler, his administration issued an apology a few years ago. It's just a great story. I won't get into it anymore, but look that up. The University of Minnesota has always been ground zero, like you said, Patrick, for queer rights and queer activism. So I digress, though. We won't get too History Channel on y'all today. For the panelists, I'm going to combine the next two questions because I think this is probably all that we'll be able to get to before we open it up for Q&A. If you're in the audience, I'm very much expecting that the creative juices are maybe flowing at this point. You're having maybe an emotional reaction to something that somebody said. Drop a comment, drop a question. We will be taking those over the next 10, 15 minutes here, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I'm going to circle back to Jason. Jason, thinking about your life after your time at the university and in the world of work, we talked about how queer people are coming out all the time. It's a constant thing that we're going through. Do you leverage your LGBTQ lens at work to better your work environment? And what does it mean to move through work being LGBTQ and a person of color and somebody who is working on their mental health and being an advocate for that? Have you been able to hold on to all those things tightly? How have you faced barriers and challenges to being who you are at work?
Yeah, I like that question, and I'm going to connect my response to also what Patrick shared about that moment that I can't get out of my head now, of like leaving your overalls on the floor and like runway walking. I'm going to assume runway walk because that's how I walk about rooms usually, because that's such a powerful story that connects to stories of now, and I think about those kinds of histories and from, Jack Baker and all the people who came before us. When I graduated from the university, I was very different story. My first job really was doing LGBTQ work in the school districts and then coming back to work at the University of Minnesota in the LGBTQ Center. And I say it's unique because, there was always a queer lens, involved in just work. And like I mentioned before, this was what, 20, I don't know years anymore. Wait a minute, 2011-ish maybe, to advocate for yourself and to be openly queer was just understood just to be what it was going to be. I was working in the GLBTA or the GSC or Gender and Sexuality Center. So for me, it was really easy to be out, right? It was never a question. My job represented my identity. The piece though about to be Black and to be queer, like on this call and like a lot of queer spaces, either in educational settings or even work settings, I find that, these queer settings are mostly white. And I find that to be queer is relatively easy, right? In so many ways. What's difficult is to remind people, as we're talking about oppression and history, that, hey, I'm Black, and there's also a Black experience to being queer. And constantly kind of maybe even acting as like a translator when I have the energy, I find myself being that person in spaces that are reminding of that other element of identity and how it compounds. I think one of the things I'm really cautious about too, when it comes to being out and being open, is I'm really critical. I think the University of Minnesota taught me how to be really critical about everything, but I'm really cautious about how we talk about LGBTQ people in the workplace, how we talk about LGBTQ people in general, because oftentimes we get into a place where we pathologize LGBTQ people and make them out to like this kind of like victim-y kind of place, knowing that there's been historically hardships. But to me, when I think about queerness and queer people, I think about resilience. I think about overalls on the floor and resisting and fighting. And so I take a lot of pride in like those histories to kind of talk about the experiences that we're having now and how they often shape us to be pretty strong. Where I find support in my community at work, being either at HealthPartners or when I was at the university as a student, I always were looking for people who were, I guess you could say, more socially justice oriented or conscious. To be openly queer for me, because it's going to be different for everybody, it always meant to critique professionalism, right? It meant to critique respectability. I was actually having a great conversation with Ani just recently about, the projection of my career and where I want to go next. And when I look at like people in leadership, I often see suit and ties and perfectly coiffed hair and all these different things. I'm like, I'm a little bit more rough around the edges, and I'm less concerned about respectability and more concerned about what you do with your role. What do you do with your queer lens? What do you do with a position or responsibility that you have? And so I'm oftentimes finding myself seeking out those kinds of people in my world, because another thing I don't see are either queer or even non-queer and trans people in leadership in organizations where they're not focused on respectability or professionalism, right? I want to see a overall throwing leader at the table more. And so that's how I've been really thinking about how I find community, how I build community, how I stay in community with people. And those are people who I seek out more so than anything these days. I hope I answered your question, Nick, because I went somewhere I wasn't expecting to go.
You went where we needed to go. So
okay.
Follow your North Star and we'll be just fine. But Jason, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is, this conversation is messy and people are messy and identity is complicated. And thank you for being here today and for bringing your racial lens, your queer lens to the conversation, because you're right. So many LGBTQ spaces, we forget that we are unintentionally finding solidarity in whiteness.
Yeah.
And employee resource groups, they look predominantly white. They don't collaborate with the Hispanic groups, with the Black groups, even with the women's groups. So if that's you on the call today and you're wondering, how can I be an ally to the Black community, to people of color, just reach out and let's start to get spaces going where we can be intersectional and where we can give people the mic that haven't traditionally had the mic. Joe, can we head to you next? Talk to us about, let's just say being out at work. I'll just simplify it.
Sure. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's broad. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been, it's taken different forms, right? Like we talked briefly about my experience before Carlson, and I think potentially why my expectations were so low going into an experience at Carlson. And, so I have sort of the first half of my life where I was 100% in the closet, right? I was on the corporate journey where it was my mission in life to climb the corporate ladder. And the environment that I was in was presented itself as incredibly homophobic, right? At the employee level where I was, it was a lot like Animal House, right? To just kind of build on Patrick's theme, and there was a lot of homophobia on the sales floor, intentional or unintentional, right? And the fact that it wasn't corrected by management said to me, it's not safe. It's not safe here, even if those people in management thought that they were allies. And so, that ultimately caused me to leave that organization and decide that being an entrepreneur was the right thing to do. But at that phase in my career, it was in my head that if I wanted to be a successful entrepreneur, I needed to be in the closet. And it wasn't until I went to Carlson and made the decision that if I'm going to go into this community, it is going to be out, and this community is going to be focused on the fact that it needs to create an accepting environment for LGBTQ people in business. And I'm not going to leave here until that's the case, which created, a whole different than experience for me being an entrepreneur after Carlson. And as an entrepreneur after Carlson, my brother and I went into business together and made the very conscious decision that we would fire clients and turn down business if they violated our core values, right? If they presented themselves as oppressive to the communities that we cared about, and that if they were racist, if they're homophobic, right? If they were those things, we were okay losing business for each other so that we could stay true to going to bed every night feeling good about the work that we were doing. And it was really scary, but lo and behold, it was the most successful we'd ever been. And so it paid off. Now there's like another 3 panels about privilege that kind of go into that. But yeah, and as quickly as I can say it, that's about my experience.
Well, Joe, quickly, because I know we're getting to time here, I just want to hone in on how you made this intentional choice to walk away from the unfair benefits that you get from being straight, from being white, from being able-bodied in our society. And when you are white and gay, I know I felt that throughout my entire life. It's like, just wipe off the makeup, just grow it up, because you will make it further. You'll make it further, because that's how the system's set up. So to walk away from those unfair advantages that are very easy to it would have been easy for you, but you made this difficult choice to say, no, we're going to lead with our values and with a worldview that I would like to see happen, even though it's not the one what we have right now. And I'm sure you've been a lot happier and more fulfilled with your life as a result of making that choice.
Yeah, I will say that if I hadn't done that, the cost of not walking away was continuing down a very dark drinking and drug path, right? That was how I coped. And so my choice was, okay, just spiral down into rock bottom so that you could continue to cope with, living a life that wasn't yours, or deal with the fact that you can be authentic, but also get sober and just see what happens when you do that. The sobriety path was incredibly painful, but it was ultimately worth it so that you could then, be authentic, and eventually the happiness comes at one point. there's just like that awful place in between.
Yeah. You really went all the way with it. I mean, to your core, you said, I'm going to show up who I am. And I just think that's great, Joe. Thank you for sharing that. I want to give it to Ani now. Ani, you have kind of a benefit here. You're a part of a small group of people that gets to really focus on, queer issues, trans issues in your work day to day. That has to be really exciting, but I'm sure there's also been challenges. So tell us about kind of how you've navigated the professional world and how this queer lens has helped you out.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it was you actually, Nick, that I said this to. I was director of programs at a small nonprofit. It was called Rainbow Health Initiative, working on research, education, and advocacy for the queer community, essentially, doing it through a lot of different ways. And by the time I got about 4 years into that job, I said, I'm never going to work in LGBT issues again. I'm exhausted. I'm done because of my own baggage that I bring to it. I'm done because the community feels an ownership over this work, but I'm the one paid staff we have to actually do this work. And I just got to a point where I'm like, this is impossible. It's under-resourced, overutilized, it's impossible. So I didn't want to do it anymore. And so I thought that my skills could be better suited. What I had learned working in the community would be better suited in a corporate environment. And I didn't know if I was going to survive. I had only worked in nonprofits before coming to Blue Cross, or like political based organizations. And so I was really pleasantly surprised that actually my skill set that I had learned in organizing, advocacy, and a nonprofit setting, as well as the fact that my public health education and experience has always been embedded in equity, there was a thirst for it in the corporate environment. And also I had access to a set of tools to get things done and to make things happen in a way that the corporate environment hadn't, at least the one I was in, hadn't previously been functioning in. And so as a result, I now do get to be involved in some really big decisions that impact the lives of those that are most marginalized. And I feel really privileged to be in that position. For me, right that now, that looks like a population health effort. As you noted in my bio, that's focused on improving care and service for trans and non-binary folks. And it's not perfect, there's no perfect approach to that. And the progress we made is phenomenal. And so I'm just going to keep doing it until people ask me or tell me I need to stop. But ultimately, yeah, I am very privileged to get to work on it. I think the trouble comes in where I have to not edit myself and worry about, are they going to think this is a pet project because I'm trans identified? Do I have to worry that they think that, they, right, decision makers are going to think that I'm personally asking them for a favor to provide equitable trans care. So all of those things that come along with decades of microaggressions and marginalization of both my identity and the community that I'm working to serve. I know time's a thing. The last thing I want to say about the allyship piece and the support and who you find community from is that I found community in Blue Cross in really unlikely places by forming relationships with folks who have some lived experience that I would have never known about, or we have some shared interests, right? And then we build on that together. And we kind of fan each other's advocacy flames and help one another kind of get to that next point. So I'm talking about white, suburban, cisgendered, straight women who care a lot, who are able to identify with gender equity issues because of their own challenges as women, who are able to kind of take their privilege and, use it for good, so to speak. And those have really been the change makers. It's like a lady named Jan from Savage who works in claims is a complete badass and is willing to help us do what we need to do to create an equitable system. And so I really try to lean on those folks and lift them up and get support from them. And I'll stop there.
I love it. Oh, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, for any attendees that are questioning, whether or not, of the 46% of people that are in the closet at work right now, I want to validate Ani's experience in another corporate environment, right? Now that I'm in the Coldwell Banker corporate environment and making the conscious decision to be out, right? You do find it in the strangest places, the generation of parents that are now supporting their LGBTQ kids, right? The people that don't know what to do, but want to know what to do, and then will come out of the woodwork to start asking questions, to learn how to be an ally just because they know that you're out, right? And so the support is there if you're able to take the leap of faith.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Ani, so much.
I want to add to that quickly. The support isn't always there, and we have to also be prepared for that. Okay, when I worked for 3 years at the Science Museum of Minnesota, and when I went to work there, this was back 89 to 92, the personnel handbook clearly said that it was the museum's policy to not discriminate based on marital status or sexual preference, but they did. And when I pointed it out to the president of the museum and I said, St. Paul is for the second time in my life in the middle of an election trying to decide whether or not I get to be a first-class citizen in St. Paul, and I'm tired of it. And he acknowledged that it was wrong, but then claimed that the museum just didn't have the resources to deal with this issue at that time. And so I went and filed a complaint at the St. Paul Human Rights Office, and the museum found the resources to hire Faegre and Benson, one of the top law firms in the state, to fight my complaint. And so and no obvious allies stepped forward as I was at the Science Museum doing this. But the good news is that within 10 or 15 years, the Science Museum finally caught up with what would be the right and equitable thing to do. And I'm sure at some point the president of the museum looked back and thought, wow, we really fucked up. We should have dealt with this way back when he first brought it to us to deal with. And so I want to be realistic in this and say, you know, we're not always, even if we've got allies, we're not always going to win the battles that we choose to take on. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, because ultimately, I don't want my headstone to say he took the easy way out. And the other thing that I want to say is that we also will make mistakes in doing what we do. And how I've dealt with that is I like rehearse the scene over and over in my head where I didn't handle it as well as I should have handled it, so that the next time this scene comes up, and it will come up, I'm prepared for handling it better because I've rehearsed it from the time I screwed up and rewritten the script, so I know how to handle it better the next time.
I like that. And I think what I'm hearing, I'm sorry, really quickly, is that I think both can be very much so true. You know, I've always been a critique, and like some of us, around like the "it gets better" campaign, and I always question, does it get better, or do we get better at it, right, over time, as we learn, as we mess up, and as we kind of challenge our own fears internally? Because the world, you're right, Patrick, I think people will continuously push, and all the allies won't just pop out of nowhere. And it's also could be very much so true that there are supported in unlikely places, I think, as well. I think both can be very, very much so true.
Yeah, I will add that when I didn't find support at work, I found support from people outside of the work through my time of Men of All Colors Together in New York, and even before that, Black and White Men Together group that I was part of in DC, and the things that led me to, like Barbara Smith, and the press that she ran in Washington, and the things that I read. So the allies may not be at work, but they're out there.
So maybe that's the closing point, Jason, is, you know, we always don't have a say in how the system is going to go and what's our experience is going to be, but we do have a say in how we get to show up and the choices about what we bring into the spaces that we walk into, and that'll always be ours.
Yeah.
So, well, unfortunately, folks, this panel, either due to my poor moderation skills or because of the amazing responses of these panelists, probably both, we are out of time. And I am a firm believer that we always need to end on time, because folks probably got their next Zoom call to get to. So I'm sure everybody, all the panelists, are available on social media. I'm sure if you want to go find them and engage with them some more. Rebecca and the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, thank you for breaking the silence on this topic. And I hope that this leads to some more conversations like this.
Yes, and thank you, Nick. No worry about time. I think the conversation was very rich, and lots of folks got a lot of great information from the conversation. There were some questions there were people were asking about how they can learn about the rich history of the university and of the LGBT community in Minnesota. And I popped in a resource in the chat about the Jean Nicholas Treader collection, which is a compilation of LGBT historical materials housed in the special collections and rare books section at the university libraries. So that's how folks can learn more about some oral histories and information about personal experiences that happened. And I want to thank each one of you for sharing your personal experience today with our audience members, and for allowing us to record this session and make it available to folks who want to learn more about your individual journeys. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, from your undergraduate experience to now work experience. Appreciate you sharing that. I know that can be a very vulnerable topic and hard to do. So thank you so much, Nick, Joe, Ani, Jason, and Patrick. Again, this recording we shared with everyone within 2 to 3 business days. And we also invite you to join our Pride Alumni Network, which is an affinity group of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. And all of the links and information I shared today and information that we may not have gotten to will be shared in our email as well with the recording. So thank you so much for your time and have a great, wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Joe, Jason, Ani, Patrick. Super fun to do this with you all.
Yeah, thank you.